Good evening, everybody. We have a really blessed opportunity. We study in Romans, and then we go back to the book of Jeremiah, and then we make our way back to the book of Revelation. Really thrilling studies, challenging studies, but really good ones. We're going to start here in just a minute, near the end of Jeremiah chapter 8. Jeremiah chapter 8. But before we start that study, I'm going to ask Brother Richard, if he would, to lead us in prayer.
Given us the opportunity that we have to come together to study thy word. Father, we're aware of so many sick, a number, Brother Luke. We ask that you be with them and comfort them and comfort their families, and it be your will that they might be returned to a measure of their much wanted health. All things thy will, not ours, be done, Father. Time of trial of our country, we pray that you be with the leaders of our nation, the nation itself, and the leaders of the nation round about the world, that they might lead in a manner that would cause people everywhere be able to worship thee without fear of molestation or harm. We pray that you be with us as we gather together to study from thy word. Pray that you might be with us, that we might take it on in our everyday life, that those round about us might not see us, but might see Christ living in us. Be with the teachers tonight, every night. Be with each of us as we study. Be better servants in that every day by day. Love us and keep us, forgive us of our sins. In Christ's holy name we pray. Amen.
The Bible says that the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah in the 13th year of a certain king. Who was that king? Josiah. Well, that means that Jeremiah then was prophesying to which kingdom? What was the name of the country to which he was prophesying? Judah. Now, there are going to be situations where we see him speaking to and about other nations, but his main work was with Judah. Just a real quick idea from the chapters that we studied last week. In chapter 5, we read that God said to Judah, I'm going to bring against you a nation that is mighty, that is ancient, and speaks a language that you don't know. And we've read a number of times that nation is going to come out of the north. Now, we know that it's going to be which people God's going to use to conquer Judah? The Babylonians. In chapter 6, we learned last week that the false prophets and the priests were saying to the people, peace, peace, but in reality, what was true about peace? There wasn't genuine peace. In chapter 7, we learned that some were saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. And God said, you're trusting in this house. You're trusting in the temple. And then in chapter 8, in part of our study last week, we learned that from the least unto the greatest of the prophets and priests, they were covetous and they spoke falsely. So that's a picture of the society in which Jeremiah was living and to which he was preaching. We're looking tonight near the end of chapter 8 as we look at the final questions. An interesting statement in verse number 20. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. If you go back and look at verse number 19, it has the feel or the ring that was a voice of the cry of the daughter of my people that are in a far country. Well, what far country could that be? Those taken into captivity in Babylon. So the appeal is, we're not saved. Well, wait a minute. Was it possible? Could they have been saved? Yeah. Was there a Redeemer available? Yeah. Look at question number 4 on chapter 8, which is on page 19 of our booklet. Well, what does that mean? The harvest is past, summer's ended, and we're not saved. We know that we're not saved part, but what about that other portion? Yeah. The time for fruit bearing The time for productive harvest was over, and they missed the boat, so to speak. Okay? And so they were left in the situation that they were in. Well, what's Jeremiah's response to that? Look at verse 21 of chapter 8. For the hurt of the daughter of my people, am I hurt? I'm black or mourning, astonishment had taken hold of me. And so I've got three things there on question 5. Basically, Jeremiah said about himself, I am what? I'm hurt. I'm what? I'm mourning, and I'm astonished. And so Jeremiah took the suffering of his people personally. I don't mean that he felt responsible for what was going on in their lives, but he was so connected with those people. When they were hurting, he was hurting. And when his nation was crumbling right before his very eyes, he was hurting. He was not indifferent. He was not callous. He was not saying, well, you deserve it. He understands the justice of God. He understands that sin cannot go unpunished. But it really hurt him to see his people like that. And you look in verse 22 at the questions that are there. Is there no balm in Gilead? Gilead was a geographic region. I'm going to try to do it where I've got the east on your right, okay? If you can picture in your mind the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River flowing down to the Dead Sea, okay? Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea. That land territory east of the Jordan between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea was called Gilead. Okay? That's that region. And it was well known for its natural medicine. And so the questions there in verse 22, is there no balm in Gilead? There was literal balm there, but he's not talking about go and fix your boo-boo on your skin, okay? He's not talking about an open sore. He's talking about balm for what ailed them, right? For their spiritual ailment. Is there no physician there? Answer. Was there a physician available for Judah? Yeah, there was. Question number 6. What physician was available? Well, who was it? God. Was the medicine available? Yeah. But here's the thing. Here's the deal with medicine. Whether you're talking about medicine for the physical body or medicine for the soul, it only works when you do what with it? You use it, when you make application. You know, that painkiller sitting on the shelf, it doesn't do any good for the pain if it stays on the shelf, right? And the balm in Gilead was available, but it wasn't going to do them any good unless they appealed and came to the one who had it available. Now let's look quickly at the overview of chapter 9 that we've got. Again, it's what we just said, verses 1 to 8. Though Jeremiah realized Judah deserved to be punished, he's really saddened by what they're facing. So we're going to see the land in desolation, again, death and waste, glory and understanding and knowing God, and then just like other nations, you know, Judah's going to be in a bad situation. Look at the wording of chapter 9 in verse 1. Oh, that my head were waters, and mine eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. You know, some of the most tender language in all of the Bible involves things that are said around the death or destruction of people. I think, you know, David, when his son Absalom died, David was devastated. I think that's a good word to describe Jeremiah. Jeremiah was devastated at what he was seeing going on among his people. And he speaks about his tears. He's weeping, and according to verse 1, that's not a one and done, as we call it. That's not a check that off my list, I've done that once and move on. He was weeping night and day. So our first question is probably one of the easiest ones in the whole booklet in consideration of Jeremiah. Why do we sometimes call him the weeping prophet? Yeah, his tears flowed, didn't they? And as you study the man's character and his approach to his task, none of us would think of Jeremiah as being a big old, what? Big old sissy, right? But he was so touched. And you think about Jesus. Jesus was compassionate. And more than once we see Jesus weeping because of sin. Now, as you look at the next question, describe the dishonesty that existed in Judah. A couple of things we'll note. Look in chapter 9 and verse 4. Take ye heed every one of his neighbor, and trust ye not in any brother. For every brother will utterly supplant, and every neighbor will walk with slanders, and they will deceive every one his neighbor, and will not speak the truth. They have taught their tongue to speak lies, and weary themselves to commit iniquity. Isn't that something? They had taught their tongue to do something. What was it? Now, when a person has been involved in some type of injury, sometimes the damage is so extensive it may involve even the mind that a person has to work to train themselves, right? They have to train those feet to walk again, train themselves to pronounce certain sounds. The people of Jeremiah's time were training themselves to lie. Sounds like they wanted to be the very most skillful liars they can be. Drop down and look at verse 8. Their tongue is as an arrow shot out. It speaketh deceit. One speaketh peacefully to his neighbor with his mouth, but what about in his heart? So what have you got there? What do you call that when a person's words come across one way, but in his heart that's not at all what he's thinking? What do you call that? That's hypocrisy right there. And so in terms of the dishonesty in the land, we'd call it widespread. And basically, what's the old saying? Well, I trust that fellow as far as I can throw him. That was the approach, basically, that Jeremiah was taking. Isn't that a sad commentary? When you have a society where honesty, integrity is not held in high esteem, when it's belittled and when it's cast aside, you have a society that is setting a course of action that's going to result in its destruction. And of course, the best place for honesty and integrity to be taught is in what place? In the home, right? When you got dads and moms who are people of integrity and demand that of their kids and demand that their kids be honest, then you've got some hope. So that's a really, unpleasant description of society. And there, in that connection, verse 6, God said they refused to know me. Now, been working on a lesson for this coming week, and I'm going to use in that lesson an idea from Romans 1 that's a description of the ancient Gentile world. They refused to know God. But remember, in Jeremiah 9, that's not a description of the heathens. That's a description of God's people who refuse to know Him. Now, in that regard, drop down to verse 13. And the Lord saith, because they have forsaken my law, which I set before them, and have not obeyed my voice, neither walked therein, but have walked after the imagination of their own heart, and after Balaam, which their fathers taught them, therefore the Lord said, basically, they're going to face the music. We talked last week, this idea of gall or wormwood in the Old Testament is connected with what concept? Bitterness. And having to face the consequence of their choices. But look at question 3 on chapter 9. Who is responsible for the people of Judah forsaking the law of the Lord? You've got themselves. What did you say, Brother Keith? The people of Judah. Here's a couple of thoughts. Number one, in verse number 13, the language is forsaking God's law. The language we've seen a few times before we get to chapter 9 is forsaking God Himself. Remember that picture back in chapter 2? that a bride cannot forget her ornaments and her attire. But my people have forgotten me days without number. So here's a thought. When God's people forsake His law, in essence, they're really forsaking God Himself, right? There's no way to walk with God and disregard what God says. Now, there are a couple of aspects mentioned there about their departure. First of all, at the end of verse 14, they followed after the Baals which our fathers taught us. So, had their forefathers, to a certain extent, had an influence on them? Yes, they had. You know, sometimes it is really hard to break that chain, as we call it. You know, last week we saw this picture in the book of Jeremiah. We called it a family affair. The kids went out and they got the wood, and the dad would get the fire, and the mom would make the food that'd be given as a sacrifice to the Queen of Heaven, to an idol. But you know, when a person grows up in an environment and they've been taught wrong religiously, they've been taught wrong morally, and they've been taught to lie or whatever it is, it's not an easy thing. It really is not an easy thing to leave behind the false ways you've been taught. So their family had had an influence on them. But the bottom line is, according to verse number 14, they'd walked after the imagination of their own heart. And so they're going to have to step up and take responsibility and make the right choices. So they're the ones responsible, okay? Now, God says you need to get some mourners. Have you ever witnessed that in modern times? What we call professional mourners. In some societies, that is as common as getting a drink of water. I'm serious. Professional mourners are brought in, and in some societies, it's an indication of wealth. The more mourners you can have, then the more, that's an indication your family has more to-do-ness, more wealth. So you read that there in verse number 17. God said, call for the mourning women. Well, mourning women are going to mourn on what occasion? Time of death. Drop down, if you would, and look at verse 21. For death has come up into our windows and has entered into our palaces to cut off the children from without and the young men from the streets. Speak, thus saith the Lord, even the carcasses of men shall fall as dung upon the open field, and the handful after the harvestman, and none shall gather them. God's speaking about coming destruction through the Babylonians. So question number 4, why did God tell Judah to call for mourners? Yeah, widespread death is on the way. And again, there's no wondering, well, why? It's because of their turning their back on God. Well, let's fill in the blank. Let's just fill in the blank. It's common for people to put their trust in blank. What's one answer? Things, money. What's another? People. Some places, maybe government. Okay? Different things. Maybe their heritage. Maybe their family's tradition. The reason I ask that is look in verse 23. Thus saith the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty man glory in his might, let not the rich man glory in his riches. Now, the condemnation is not for being rich. The condemnation is not for demonstrating wisdom. The condemnation is in what? Trusting and glorying in yourself. But verse 24, but let him that glorieth glory in this, that he understandeth and knoweth me, that I am the Lord which exercise loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. For in all these things I delight, saith the Lord. So our answer on number 5, instead of glorying in human wisdom, human might, or material riches, in what should Judah glory? in knowing and understanding God. Now, does your Bible have a marginal reference to a New Testament verse? There beside verse number 24. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 1, I believe it's verse 31. You know, in 1 Corinthians 1, and it actually carries over into 1 Corinthians 2 and 3, Paul, he's writing to the church in Corinth, which was a part of the Greek culture. The Greeks put a lot of stock in human wisdom and human philosophy. And so Paul was driving home the point. We can't trust in human wisdom when we can't trust in ourselves. Rather, we need to trust in the God of heaven. Now, I know that may sound simplistic to some, but what Judah needed was not a coin that said, "In God we trust." They needed a life that was, "In God we trust." And when you get a lot of people with that mentality, what a blessing it is to society. Okay? Now, chapter 10. Chapter 10, we've simply labeled God's uniqueness and the folly of worshiping idols. Okay? Look with me at the first couple of verses of chapter 10. "Hear ye the word which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen or the nations, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven. For the heathen or the Gentiles are dismayed at them." What do you make of that language, the signs of heaven? I think we're looking here at the idea of worship of the sun, moon, heavenly beings, and making decisions. Somebody says, "Well, I never would have thought we'd have won that game. Boy, the stars were lined up that day, or the planets were lined up." It has absolutely zero influence on the choices that humans make. Well, here's our question. Why did God forbid His people to learn the way of the heathens or the Gentiles? Why would He do that? To turn them away from God. But before they ever went in the land of Canaan, God said, "I don't want you intermarrying. I don't want your children intermarrying with the Canaanites." Why? I know what's going to happen. They'll be influenced, and they'll go off and they'll follow their gods. Hold your place here, if you would, and turn with me to the book of 2 Kings. In 2 Kings 23 is a record of some of the reforms that our man Josiah was carrying out. And you remember what's interesting, and I think revealing, we noted in the first night of class that in the book of Jeremiah doesn't mention any of those reforms of Josiah, which makes us think that perhaps those reforms, even though he was sincere and devout in carrying them out, they did not really have a big effect on society. But look in chapter 23 and verse 5. This is talking about Josiah. "He put down the idolatrous priest whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense in the high places in the cities of Judah and in the places round about Jerusalem. Them also that burned incense unto Baal, they burned incense to the sun and to the moon and to the planets or the constellations and to all the host of heaven." What did you have going on in Judah in the days of Josiah? You had people worshiping what? Whatever's up there in outer space. Well, they didn't learn that from Jehovah. In fact, the law of Moses plainly said, you don't mess with that stuff. You don't tamper with it. And so, here it is about 600 years before the coming of the Christ. And God's message here in chapter 10 again is you don't go and learn from the heathens. Now, if you would take just a moment, in our booklet on page 21, there is a table on which we have a contrast between man-made gods or idols and the true and living God. And I think I've got 10 distinct points there. There perhaps are others. This is not borrowed or stolen, but I just went through the text. And, it's pretty clear. One of the things that's fascinating to me in terms of the description here of the idols, Look in your Bible at verse 5. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be born. Somebody has to move them, right? Because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do what? Evil. Neither is it in them to do what? Good. So no, we might say it this way. They are powerless to bless, and they're powerless to curse. How much sense does it make to serve them then? They can't bless you, and they can't curse you. You know, as you and I read and study the Bible, maybe here's a book or a chapter we've read, a gazillion times. But you come back and you read it again or you study it again, and that verse was there all along. You just didn't pay attention. Well, I got me one of those verses in chapter 10, and Lord willing, I'm going to use that thing in a sermon this coming Sunday. Let me say this. I don't remember ever using it in my life in a sermon, but I'm going to use it this Sunday. If my wife's husband remembers, he's going to use it. Look at verse number 12. Oh, I love this. And I've got 3 words circled in green in my Bible in verse 12. It's talking about God. He made the earth by His power. He's established the world by His wisdom. And He stretched out the heavens by His discretion. So, God, in making the world, the earth, the heavens, God demonstrated His power, God demonstrated His wisdom, and God demonstrated His discretion. And God willing, I'm going to use that verse as we talk this Sunday about design in nature. You see design and things, the way they work in the human body and other things. God's power, God's wisdom, and God's discretion. Okay? Now, look at question number 3. But that's an interesting chart, and I hope that's one to which you can come back and make reference from time to time. But question number 3, who or what is the portion of Jacob? I'm reading that verse now, verse 16. God said, the portion of Jacob is not like them, not like the idols. For He, that is the portion, is the former or maker of all things. And Israel is the rod of His inheritance. The Lord of hosts is His name. Here's one of those verses where a phrase is used, the portion of Jacob. And as you read on in verse 16, the portion of Jacob is identified or renamed 2 times. How else is the portion of Jacob described in verse 16? The Lord of hosts, that's right. And what's the other one before that? The former or the maker of all things. Okay. So who is it? It's Jehovah God, right? He's the portion or the inheritance of Judah. Well, if that's the case, then a wise commitment on their part would be what? Let's stick with God. Let's stick with God. We've spoken before about the leadership issues in the nation, and that's a theme we'll see more than one time. But if you would, drop down in chapter 10 to verse 21, and we'll see something about this lack of leadership and how it influenced the country. For the pastors or shepherds are become brutish or dull-hearted, and have not sought the Lord. Therefore, they shall not prosper, and all their flocks shall be scattered. First of all, let's identify. In this passage, when he talks about shepherds or pastors, are you thinking that has reference to literal shepherds who take care of literal sheep? Or are we talking about those who are in the realm of spiritual leadership? It'd be the leaders in the nation, wouldn't it, Brother Keith? Okay, so look at question number 4. What role did the shepherds play in Judah's fall? They didn't look to God. And when you have leadership that does not look to God for guidance, then normally the fellowship will not look to God for guidance. And so as a result of their failure, what's going to happen to the flock? It's going to be scattered. Now, we'll get to it eventually, but in chapter 23, of this letter, of this book. The first couple of verses are going to come back and have a strong message again for the shepherds that, well, just in general, what should shepherds be doing for the welfare of the flock? What would that include? Johnny, what should they be doing for the flock? Feeding them. What else? Protecting them. Looking out for their best interest. If one of them goes astray, what are you going to do? You're going to go after them. If one of them becomes diseased, what are you going to do? You're going to try to get it back to good health. Well, the shepherds in Jeremiah's time, they didn't care about the sheep. They cared about themselves. Okay. And so the sheep were neglected, and that put the sheep in a vulnerable position. Okay? And so we'll see that as we work through this lesson together. Okay? Some of y'all wrote verse 23 tonight and did a great job. O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. So, question 5, what does Jeremiah say? Man's not capable of what? Guiding himself. Now, here's the deal. Verse 23 doesn't give us the answer. But if man is not capable of setting out for himself the right course of life, and I'm not talking about choosing an occupation or choosing a spouse, but if humans don't have the mental wherewithal to chart for themselves a course in life that says this is absolutely the correct thing to do, then what do humans need? They need guidance. They need help. They need what we sometimes call, we say, well, let's call in some outside help. We got something going on in a community, and we can't take it. We need to call in some outside help. Judah needed some outside help. And that help, of course, was God. But when you have human beings whose response to God is, I'm good, I got this, then, that's going to be a problem. Judah needed to humble themselves, recognize their limitations, and turn back to the God of heaven. Thoughts you want to share here on chapter 10 before we go into chapter 11? I sense a conspiracy, y'all. And I don't mean in the classroom. Chapter 11 is about 2 conspiracies. One conspiracy is Judah's conspiracy against God in breaking the covenant. And the other conspiracy was personal in the life of Jeremiah because the folks of his hometown, they were out to get him. If you look at the overview there, verses 1 to 8, Jeremiah exhorts the people to keep the covenant. Verses 9 to 17, Judah's conspiracy in breaking the covenant. And then the men of Anathoth conspire to kill Jeremiah. Look, if you would, it's not one of our questions, but look in verse number 4. And what God is doing here is he's going back and looking at their ancestors and how they conducted themselves. And at the end of verse number 3, it talks about the words of this covenant. What does the word covenant mean? It's an agreement, right? And when God's involved with humans in a covenant, who's the one that sets all the terms and conditions? God does, okay? And so it's a look back at the reality they hadn't kept the covenant, verse 4, which I commanded your fathers in the day that I brought them forth out of the land of Egypt from the iron furnace, saying, obey my voice and do them according to all which I command you, so shall you be my people, and I will be your God. So here it is, so to speak. God reaches out his hand with this promise. You will be my people, and I will be your God. Well, what condition do you see there for that to be true? In other words, it's basically an unspoken, if you do this, then here's the relationship we'll have. You'll be my people, I'll be your God. According to verse 4, what's required on their part? Do what he said. Do what he said. And that's an Old Testament thought, but it's a New Testament principle. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where we read Paul's appealing to brethren there in court to come out from among them and be separate, he goes back to this Old Testament promise. God said, I'll walk with you and I'll be your God, okay? Question number 1 on chapter 11. What conspiracy did God find in Judah? Let's look at verse 9 and verse 10. And the Lord said unto me, a conspiracy is found among the men of Judah and among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Well, here are some of the general thoughts. Number one, they're turned back to the iniquities of their forefathers. Number two, refuse to hear my words. Number three, they went after other gods to serve them. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken my covenant which I made with their fathers. So again, in general, in what ways have they broken the covenant? What do you see there in verse 10? They've done what? Yep. What else? Went and served other gods? Would not hear his words. Okay? Would not hear his words. In God's sight, that was covenant breaking. All right? Covenant breaking. We read in chapter 10 this distinction between the idols and the true God. When, what we're going to see is when Judah got in trouble, to whom would they turn to bail them out? Well, who's available today, right? In some cases, they do turn to God to bail them out. That is, they cry out to God. In some cases, they turn to their idols to bail them out. In some cases, they turn to Assyria, right, or Egypt to bail them out. Look at verse number 12. Then shall the cities of Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem go and cry unto the gods unto whom they offer incense, but they shall not save them at all in the time of their trouble. So our question is, number two, what could false gods not do for the people of Judah? Save them in the time of their trouble, okay? And once you've written that, I want to share something with you that's kind of well, in English, it's got a ring to it, okay? It wouldn't work in other languages, but in English it does. According to verse 12, idols could not save them, right? Now drop down to verse 14. God's message to Jeremiah is, therefore pray not thou for this people, neither lift up a cry or prayer for them, for I will not hear them in the time that they cry unto me for their trouble. So here it is. Verse 12, idols could not save them. Verse 14, the Lord would not save them under the present circumstances. God could, but he would not under the circumstances. And so if they're going to be back in the right relationship with God, it's not going to be God that needs to make a move. They're going to be the ones that need to take a move. Now, we saw back in chapter 7 that God told Jeremiah, don't even bother doing what for Judah? Don't even bother making intercession or praying. Look again at question 3, and we'll go back and read the text. Question 3, why would God refuse to hear Judah's cry for help or Jeremiah's prayer of intercession? Look at verse 13. For according to the number of thy cities were thy gods, O Judah. I wonder how many cities they had. Well, the wording is, how many cities you got, that's how many gods you got. Well, historically speaking, they had a bunch. And according to the number of the streets of Jerusalem, have you set up altars to that shameful thing, even altars to burn incense unto? But just imagine here in East Ridge, on every street, there's an altar set up for idols. He said, well, that'd be a lot. And you know what? In some cultures of the world today, there's way more than one altar on one street. But the point we don't want to miss is, this is God's people. And the question we've talked about, how can God's people get to the point where they've got an idol under every green tree, on top of every hill, and on every street? How can you get to that point? Part of the answer has to be when you don't have your heart filled with love for the Lord, there's no telling where you're going to end up. Right? If they'd been devoted to Him, then worshiping an idol wouldn't even have been a temptation. Okay? And then verse 14, therefore pray not for them. Okay? because of the shameful things they were doing. So that's the answer, because Judah committed evil by turning to multiple gods. It seems like, what do we call that, human nature? According to verse 14, the latter part of that verse, they're going to cry unto God when what happens? When what comes down the pipe in their life? Trouble. Where's that fire extinguisher when you need it? That's the way a lot of people approach God. He's a fire extinguisher. When my life is on fire and I've got all these troubles and I've tried everything possible, humanly possible, and I can't fix it, well, maybe I'll just call on God and He'll get that fire extinguisher out and He'll get me out of this trouble. The Bible says in Proverbs 28 and verse 9, he that turns his ear away from hearing the law, even his prayer shall be abomination. And we read back in chapter 9, I think it was, that the people had forsaken God's law. And when people forsake God's law, they can cry all they want to. God's not going to hear until they have a heart that's penitent and ready to do His will. So there's one what's the word I want to use? Not catastrophe. There's one conspiracy that's God's people against Him. There's another conspiracy, and it sounds like Jeremiah wasn't aware of it. And the Lord told him there was somebody out to get Jeremiah. Who was it? His home folk. What's the name of the town that Jeremiah was from? Anathoth. We read it back in chapter 1 and verse 1. Look down, if you would, in verse number 21. Verse 21. Therefore thus saith the Lord of the men of Anathoth, that seek thy life, saying, prophesy not in the name of the Lord, that thou die not by our hand. In other words, if you keep preaching in God's name, what are we going to have? We're going to have a funeral. You're going to die. It's not the only time in the Bible that we read about God's people being threatened. In the city of Jerusalem, after the church was established, the Jewish council said to the apostles, said, don't you ever preach in His name again in this city. What did they do? They preached. They said, well, whether it's right to do that or not, you decide. Said, we cannot not say the things that we know. And there have been men and women in biblical times whose life was in danger because of their commitment to preach. Verse 22, therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts, behold, I will punish them. The young men shall die by the sword, their sons and their daughters shall die by famine, and there'll be no remnant of them. For I will bring catastrophe, evil upon the men of Anathoth, even the year of their visitation. So what should that have meant to Jeremiah about his preaching? Preach on, son. That's right. Proved by God, and you preach on. So answer to number 4 is, why was God going to bring catastrophe on them? Because they plotted to do what? To kill Jeremiah. Yeah. So, we've already seen tonight, don't listen to them when they talk, because you can't trust them. And now then we see their true colors here. People show their attitude toward God by how they respond to what God says. Let me repeat that. People show their attitude toward God by how they respond to what God says. Okay? People that love the Lord love what God has to say. Now, in chapter 12, Jeremiah's got some questions. He's not the first and he's not the last prophet to have questions. And his question was, why do the wicked prosper? It looks like the wicked have it pretty good. They're prospering. They look pretty happy to me. Look at verse 1. Righteous art thou, O Lord, when I plead with thee. Yet let me talk with thee of thy judgments. He says there is something though I would like to know about. Wherefore, why doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they happy that deal very treacherously? And it seems like the unstated question is, why aren't you dealing with this? You see the wickedness in the land. They look like happy folks. In a similar thought in the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk was a contemporary with Jeremiah. Habakkuk spoke about the corruption in society. He asked God the question, how long is this stuff going to go on? Basically, how long are you going to just sit idly by and not deal with it? That was his first question. And then God answered. God basically said to Habakkuk, I'm going to deal with it. He said, in fact, I'm going to tell you how I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to bring the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, and I'm going to deal with the people of Judah. And then Habakkuk had another question. He said, how in the world are you going to use the heathen? He said, they're worse than we are. Well, you know, when you ask a question, you better be ready to get the answer. So Jeremiah is concerned that it looks like the way of the righteous is prospering. Why are they happy? Why are they prospering? Well, God gives let's read verse 5 and see how we're going to describe this. Here's his message to Jeremiah personally. If thou hast run with the footmen, and they've wearied thee, then how canst thou contend with horses? And if in the land of peace wherein thou trustest they weary thee, then how shalt thou do in the swelling of Jordan or in the flood plain? Here's a picture. If Jeremiah, if you've been running and trying to keep up with foot soldiers and you're all tuckered out, boy, how are you going to do it when you're trying to keep up with horses that are running? How are you going to do that? And if you're living in a land that has a semblance of peace in it, how are you going to survive when the flood comes? I'm not certain he's talking about a flood of water. He may be talking about the flood of the Babylonians. What's it sound like to you God's trying to get across to Jeremiah? Is Jeremiah facing trials and challenges? Yeah. Don't quit. And in the old song, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to get worse before it gets better. And so don't quit. Persevere. And sometimes we may think, how could it get any worse? It could get worse for Jeremiah. The people of Anathoth wanted to kill him. Were they successful? No. No, they weren't. All right? So that's kind of the idea, perk him up, to encourage him to keep at it. And again, back to what we said earlier, if you go on and read to verse 6, here's part of the flood and the horses, so to speak, with which he was going to deal. For even thy brethren and the house of thy father, even they have dealt treacherously with thee. Yea, they have called a multitude after thee. Believe them not, though they speak fair or good words unto thee. It kind of reminds me of what Jesus said. A man's foes shall be whom? Those of his own household, Matthew 10:37. So the answer there on question number 3 is what? Why shouldn't he believe his own relatives? They're after him. They speak smooth words, but they're dealing treacherously with him. Okay? Sounds like Jeremiah needs to find a way to put his trust in whom? In God. Question 4, I'll let you deal with that. It's the idea that it's God's people or his heritage and vineyard and portion. You'll see that a number of times. We got a couple of minutes. So let's take a quick look at chapter 13. And we're simply labeling this chapter Judah's pride and a worthless linen sash or girdle. And what we see in the book of Jeremiah, as we do in some of the prophets, is a number of symbolic acts. Jeremiah's going to do something, and then there'll be an explanation. Here's the spiritual application. God said, go and get yourself a linen sash or girdle, verse 1. Put it on, but don't put it in water. That's phase 1. Phase 2, you take that thing, verse 4, and you take it over to the Euphrates, and you hide it in a hole in a rock. And he did that. And then verse 6, phase 3, you go back over there to Euphrates, and you get that thing again. So you get one, and you wear it. That's phase 1. Phase 2, you take it, and you hide it by the Euphrates. Phase 3, at a later time, you go back and get it from the Euphrates. Question number 1. When God gave Jeremiah instructions in 3 phases about what to do with the linen sash, how much did Jeremiah submit to what the Lord told him to do? He did according to the word of the Lord. That sounds an awful lot like what we read back in Genesis 6:22. When Noah had been given those instructions about the ark, so did Noah according to all the Lord commanded. Let me just end with this appeal tonight. Don't ever overlook, don't ever minimize what we might call simple obedience. God said, go get a sash. He did. God said, go hide that body Euphrates. He did. God said, go and get it again. He did. There's no substitute for doing what God said. And here's the thing. If we won't be faithful in doing the little things, what? Then we're not setting ourselves up to be faithful in the other things. So put a marker right there, and we'll start next week in chapter 13. And we're getting into a section now where we're going to be seeing a lot more variety. I know in some of those early chapters, it felt like you're seeing some of the same things repeated. A lot of variety coming up, all right? And we're going to hear about a man by the name of Manasseh. Oh, boy. All right. Enjoyed the class.